So next is the panel, The Making a Regenerative Pandemic, with Dr. Timothy LaSalle, Larry Copal, Thomas Newmark, and Dr. Cindy DeLay.
Well, hello, and thank you for the invitation to be here to speak with you today, Miguel, and organizers. The title of our panel discussion is The Making of a Regenerative Pandemic. My name is Cindy Daly. I'm with the Center for Regenerative Agriculture and Resilient Systems at California State University at Chico. And this particular panel is co-sponsored by the Carbon Underground. The panelists that will be presenting today include Dr. Tim LaSalle, who's the founder and co-director for the Center for Regenerative Agriculture at Cal State Chico, Tom Newmark, founder and chair of the Carbon Underground, and Larry Copalt, the founder and president of the Carbon Underground. We're going to begin this panel, and I'll introduce each speaker as we move through the panelists. Each panelist will have 10 minutes to present, and then we'll end up with I'm hoping that we'll have 10 to 15 minutes of time for Q&A. So for those that are participating in the conference, please use the chat, and I'll try to make sure that your questions are served in that way. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Tim LaSalle. Tim LaSalle has served as the first CEO of Rodale Institute. He's has been the executive director of the Allen Savory Center for Holistic Management, consultant and advisor, and a research coordinator for the Howard Buffett Foundation in Africa on soils and food security for smallholder farmers. He's also the professor emeritus for Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, but we won't hold that against him. He's also the former president and CEO of the California Ag Leadership Program, where he arranged the educational leadership programs in more than 80 countries with the heads of states, ministers, and community leaders. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Tim. Do you want to go ahead and share your screen? And I'm going to pass the mic to you.
Cindy, thank you very much for the introduction. It's indeed a pleasure to be here today with you and Tom and Larry to talk about trying to move regenerative agriculture into a pandemic-like flow where we're actually getting a scenario where this mechanism of regenerating soil is present around the world. In making of a regenerative pandemic for this conference, what I want to do is we're going to have to take a moment to say, where do we find ourselves on the planet? We find that we have not been particularly good stewards, and Antonio Guterres reminded us in 2018 that by 2020, if we don't make a major change on how we're caring for the planet's atmosphere, we're actually going to be at tremendous risk, and maybe at a point that we can't turn it around. That means today. That means the urgency faces us today. We on the West Coast know about this urgency, but what I find really concerning is not just the severity of the kind of risks that the weather change is causing to our environment and to our own survivability. This now is stretching, if you look at the news, to Siberia. And they have been experiencing weather of over 100 degrees with serious forest fires. In these scenarios, we're emitting so much more carbon to the atmosphere than any of our discussions that we thought about in the past because we were just trying to manage our fossil fuels. These are a grave concern and really puts us at, I think, a milestone question of should we be having any conversations around looking at 400 parts per million or 450, when we had posited that we were going to shoot for 350, and we believed that was survivable. But you know, when you look at this chart, is it? There is no point in history, as far as human species on this planet, that has survived an over 400 parts or even an over 300 parts. And I think we have to begin to think in terms of how do we return it to 280? That's where the climate sustained life on this planet as we know it and fed the people. What we have in today's conversation is an opportunity to think about how soil can get us back to that 280. But let's also realize that not only are fossil fuels a problem, we have lost so much carbon out of our soils that it's the kind of thing that sort of reassures us it not only has the capacity to get it back in there, but I will posit today we could to a robust level more than what soils originally had before we started to farm and plow. A dear friend of ours, Roland Bunch, had said about 8 years ago that there was a tragedy rushing towards Africa of a famine. And what happened is he missed this prediction by a few months. It wasn't that he was really a climatologist and he could predict rain. It was he was watching those soils have the carbon farmed out of them. And the people were experiencing flash floods and a drought at the same time. Because when the rains hit, no carbon, no organic matter to pull that moisture in. It ran off, they had flash floods, the sun came out, the soil dried, and food was short. We know that as we've treated soils this way, that FAO told us we had 60 years left at the speed with which we're degrading them. But let's be more real. That was in 2015. At best, that's 55 years left. So erosion is one of the critical pieces of what we're doing in not only the loss of carbon, but actual loss of topsoil that can hold this carbon. The picture in the upper left is a field next to mine and the work I was doing in Africa, and it was sandy, and one rain event with only one disking event produced massive erosion. The picture in the upper right is some work my wife and I were doing in Burundi. Every square inch of that country is tilled, and all of that soil is washing into the Aswan Dam in Egypt. And the lower right is just a neighbor of mine here on the central coast of California, because everybody thinks you need to till. And his soil ended up in the middle of a county road, being hauled away by a tractor and a dump truck and deposited who knows where, but certainly not where it would capture carbon or produce food. What have we learned? You know, we went through the Dust Bowl in '35. We established a whole government agency to take care of this. But I have a film of just a dust situation in Tanzania that just blows your mind. We continue to do this same repeated behavior around the world every day. But we need to regenerate these soils, and we need, therefore, to bring life back into them so these soils can aggregate. These are two examples of two of my soils. This one in the center here is a soil of mine on the left here in California that was 10 days sitting in that jar and still remained aggregated because of the biology that lived in that soil. Whereas my neighbors at Dist, it just continually disaggregated, and that's, of course, really liable to erosion and loss both in rains and wind. On the right is the African soils, that sandy field, and you see the aggregation that's occurred here, very clear water. The biology had been able to glue those soil pieces together, leaving air spaces and percolation capacity, where that field that eroded melted away in this water and dissolved. We have to be able to hold on to the soils, not just so we can grow food, not just so we can capture carbon, but so we can sustain the biology. And what's important about this slide from Ghana, with a dear friend of mine, Dr. Kofi Boa, who was doing research there, and I was helping them set up some research plots. There's two treatments here. In the back is a treatment for cowpeas, where you see a full crop, a crop that actually is providing food for the season in a rain-short year. In the front, in the foreground, is the same cowpea. No. And what's the treatment difference? The front is a disaster, it's a famine. The crop in the back is food security. And the only treatment difference was tillage. The back field was not tilled, the front plot was tilled. So what we see is how biology, when it's allowed to begin to grow and the fungal communities are able to send out their rhizomes, you can start to move water and nutrients to those plants and produce food. So what is regenerative agriculture? It really describes farming and grazing practices that, among other benefits, reverse climate change by rebuilding soil organic matter and restoring degraded soil biodiversity, resulting in both carbon drawdown and improving the water cycle. You know, we'd all look to the Green Revolution as saving so many lives in the world, but new histories are telling us that what Green Revolution? If you look at the chart, because as they've reviewed the years, actual when it happened was just after this dip when there was a drought year. All crops increased after the rains came back. And the dark bars in there are wheat that we were saying was the Borlaug wheat that really fed so many people. But look at the coarse grains on the top and also look at the rice on the bottom. They were not part of that green revolution. They also performed just as well. This is where I think Howard Buffett's point was the brown revolution, the soil. This is the part that we're talking about. Dr. David Johnson, who's now also an adjunct professor with Cindy and I at Chico State, as really changing paradigms in three primary areas, moving us from a geochemical conversation about soil to a living biology, knowing that the fungal piece is really crucial, that we disturb every time we till or if we apply chemicals. What happens is the systems actually become self-fertilized, and I'll show you a slide on that. It's an amazing piece of paradigm change for all of us to think about. Also, changing our paradigm and way of thinking is how much carbon could be captured in those soils. Most science is telling us it's about 0.5 ton per hectare is kind of where we could go, maybe up to 1 ton. But in essence, according to a farm practice and according to David Johnson's work in a different part of the country, between 10 and 19 tons is what's being shown in those data points. That's the kind of information that should make scientists become quite inquisitory and quite interested in investigating instead of dismissing. That's the kind of data that should get all of us involved in this as rapidly as we can be. In crop productivity, this paradigm shift that this biological system brings improves photosynthesis efficiency, which actually means it reduces the amount of carbon respiration, which is a paradigm change in the scientific community, because there's always an assumption the more organic matter you put in the system, the more gets respired. And that is not true. And what's making it not true is how we begin to bring this fungal dominant biology back to a soil that we've farmed it out of. We have to return that health. So the fungal communities actually bring hard, resilient carbon. Some of it can last in the soil up to 1,000 years. It secretes a glomalin, which glues particles of soil together, which is hard carbon and wants to sit there. But it transports nutrients, and it creates exchanges and communicates with the plant through signaling mechanisms. We know when we start to look at soil as both the plant, the root, the biology, and the mineral matter, we begin to see this activity in life going on. If we put fertilizers in the system, we stop this life. But plants feed these organisms sugars and carbohydrates because the organisms is where they're going to get these nutrients that they need for their resiliency and for their ability to actually produce food. What I think is really interesting when we begin to engage now is to understand the biology of what's going on here, is there is a rhizophagy going on where these plant root tips are absorbing the organisms and pulling nutrients out of them. And I'm not sure we knew that before. And then they're re-emitting those organisms so that they can go out, recover nutrients and bring it back to the plant. And so we start to see the kinds of responses when we only apply biology that are quite remarkable. In Africa, I begin to see responses that were competitive with full-scale fertilized-based systems. It really made scientists scratch their head. But it goes back to the kinds of conversations David Johnson's have had with us on focusing on soil biology and health and fungal dominance. The ratio of productivity in the soil to the plant is higher to the fungal bacterial ratio than it is to nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium. And the percent of soil carbon respired is that as you're gaining in these fungal dominant soils 10 times the amount of carbon, you're respiring only 4 times the amount of carbon. And that's where we make the tremendous gains. It's why we can begin to think in terms of, instead of the old studies of 1 ton or 0.5 ton of carbon per hectare, of 10 to maybe 19 tons per hectare that can be captured. And there's a farmer that actually has the same numbers that live in his fields based upon his time when he started farming in 1993 until present, and that's Gabe Brown. And if you look at his data, it's the same amount that David Johnson was getting. One of the things that I think we want to challenge scientifically is this concept that soil plateaus and how much carbon it can capture. And let's look at Roland Bunch, a friend of ours and a colleague, who said, when I met him in Central America, he said, we're making over an inch of topsoil a year, and there's not a textbook in the world that says you can do that. And I know they were doing that. And Gabe Brown says, you know, we're finding soil aggregation at 48 inches. And he says, we've got to look deeper. Who knew you could start to send the biology and the roots 48 inches in an agricultural cropping system, therefore depositing carbon that deep? We can grow our soils, which means we can grow our capacities to actually capture carbon. So let's get busy. But in getting busy, that means we have to convert farmers around the world. And in the last 4 years, I've been in India and Peru working with farmers that are dependent on glacial water, which is disappearing. We did a lot of work on adoption theory. And how do we get all the way down to the late majority of farmers? So we get 2/3 to 3/4 of the farmers to convert to regenerative fast. We need a language. We need a language that they understand. We need a way to break through the barriers. And I would posit that as much as we love organic, we've been at that for almost 100 years, and it's still less than 1%. So that's not really a pathway forward. We have to find the best currency, and it's probably money, but we have to look at the barriers, the peer pressure, the training and competencies that people carry in themselves and that they hold on to, their fear of failure, and all the other psychological realms of defending against change. What is the language needed? First, we must de-escalate this battle that we have about organic or not organic. We need to really work on communicating with everyone because we need everyone. We need to inspire the curiosity and the inquiry, as well as provide incentives. And here's an incentive. This is a trial that Cindy and I and David Johnson are involved in Arizona, where if you look at the corn volume numbers here, in a conventional trial, we had 217 bushels an acre on very poor soil, but full suite of 256 pounds of nitrogen applied. And then we applied the biology with just 38 pounds of nitrogen, and then we applied no nitrogen. And as you see, what we have here is we have a scenario where we ended up with capturing biologically created nitrogen in a non-leguminous crop, 107 pounds of nitrogen in the beam, the biologically enhanced, 80 pounds in the biologically enhanced plus 15% normal nitrogen, and a loss to the environment, which means to the atmosphere or to the water, 126 pounds of nitrogen. The next part to this is that here's the currency of communication. We have to get farmers to understand they can save $120 to $90 an acre by pulling these fertilizers out. This was the first year of the experiment. We anticipate the biologically enhanced to start to perform as well, if not better, than these other two trials as we move into the year 2, 3, and 4. The farmer that's working with us there, he and I worked together in Africa, and I showed him my corn. I showed him all of the productivity that we could get biologically, but not until he walks out of his own field in Arizona looking at the difference does he say, why am I buying fertilizer? And these are the kinds of communication points we need to help convert farmers to a regenerative world and start to save and store the carbon back where it needs to be. Regenerative agriculture can take us back, but we need everybody involved. And I'm delighted both to let my two colleagues follow in this conversation, both to tie a little bit of a ribbon around this in our thinking in a broader way, as well as in ways to think in terms of how we include even more in this conversation. And with that, I thank you for the opportunity, Miguel, and thank you, Cindy. May I pass it back to you?
Thank you so much, Tim. That was a lovely foundation in regenerative agriculture, albeit by a fire hose. That was a tremendous amount of information delivered in 15 quick minutes. And so without further ado, I'm going to move on now to our next panelist, whose job is to tie the regenerative agricultural movement really to this pandemic that we've experienced over the course of the last several months. Our next speaker is Tom Newmark, who has spent 14 years in the natural vitamin and supplement industry, building New Chapter into the #1 company in the industry before it was sold to Procter & Gamble. Tom is the chairman of Greenpeace Fund USA, chairman of the American Botanical Council, founder of Sacred Seeds, and co-owner of Finca Luna Nueve, I love that name, biodynamic and regenerative farming operation in Costa Rica that administers a tropical farming systems trial. It's truly amazing. You need to visit the website. In his past, he was a corporate attorney and an entrepreneur from which he claims to be recovering. And aren't we glad for it? So with that, Tom, I'm turning it over to you. Please share your screen.
Thank you, Cindy. Let's see if I can cue this up. So thank you for the opportunity to chat with you all today about regenerative agriculture in the time of COVID. It's tough enough to be grappling with the broken carbon and water cycles and the collapse of food production while contending, as Tim explained, with existential climate change. And now we have this pandemic to deal with. The thing is, it's all in some way related, and this talk today will examine that linkage. In this talk, I will share with you my conjecture how regenerative agriculture might be just what the world needs to keep future pandemics from happening. But first, let's talk about my farm in Costa Rica. In 1994, we founded Finca Luna Nueva in Costa Rica, and we started with building an ideal organic ginger and turmeric farm. So we're located on the Caribbean slope of Costa Rica, which is a humid tropical rainforest. We are in an area with volcanic soil, plenty of rain, never gets cold. It's a paradise for growing tropical crops. And this is the natural history of our place. Everything wants to become a rainforest on the Caribbean slope of Costa Rica. Give any land that chance, and it will become a rainforest. So when we created our farm, we attempted to mystically convert what wants to be a rainforest into this, which was an early form of our organic at the time turmeric farm. And it was highly successful. The turmeric growing next to the rainforest was spectacular. And notice how we farmed, though. Everything was planted in a row, linear, orderly, straight, non-random, monoculture, like nothing in a rainforest ever is. And perhaps inevitably, because of the way we were planting, although it was both organic and biodynamic, disease hit, fusarium happened. The fusarium was on the attack and it threatened our entire harvest. We contacted the then head of the Demeter program in the United States, Jim Fulmer, seeking a quick fix. What biodynamic prep should we spray? What could we do to save our harvest? And Jim responded, why are you asking me? And we said, because you're our biodynamic guide and certifier, and you hopefully have some answers because we're about to lose our entire harvest. And Jim declined to give us a recommendation, reminding us that in biodynamics, the farm is a living wholeness, and therefore we should go out and listen to the farm. He said the farm will tell us what to do. So our founder, Stephen Farrow, and our lead farmer, Carlos Arias, went out into the fields and they listened. And they thought that what they heard the farm say was plant us in mounds, as you'll see in this picture, not in rows. The rows, it turned out, were like an electric wire, a cable, which conducted the fusarium pathogen and infected every plant. But once we planted in mounds, we broke the conduit, and the fusarium problem got a little better. But over the next 2 decades, we evolved from being certified organic to being Demeter certified biodynamic, and finally, we really heard what the land needed. We embraced the complexity and diversity of regenerative agriculture. In our case, given our location in the Central American humid rainforest, we're now farming agro-ecologically with the planting structure that is commercially practical, yet in meaningful ways approaches the noise and clutter of a rainforest. It's obviously more structured than the rainforest to which we are contiguous. It's not the chaos that Charles Darwin described when he first viewed the New World tropics, but it is no longer planting monoculture annual crops in rows. Now, this is what everyone is thinking. Will regenerative agriculture, and here we are, will regenerative agriculture end our COVID-19 nightmare? That's my assigned topic after all. So how does my farm's history bear on this? How does the evolution of our farm from organic to biodynamic and then finally to regenerative relate to our human vulnerability to pandemics? And here's how. It turns out that there is now a very clear disease biological diversity association, and we impoverish the ecosystem at our own peril. In this 2020 article with Dr. Felicia Keesing being highlighted, she explains that as biodiversity disappears, the risk to human health increases. And in a world where there are fewer and fewer of most kinds of wild creatures and more domesticated creatures and humans, Keesing says, we're at the risk of losing wild species, but we're doing it at the expense of increases in just a minor, tiny number of species. And these domesticated species tend to be less diverse. A lot of the same crops worldwide, raising a lot of the same animals, which makes it easier for pathogens. It's easier for them to move about. And in a book that I recommend to all of you by Dr. Rob Wallace, he frames the case for biodiversity in a way that I find very appealing. Quote, deforestation and intensive agriculture may strip out traditional agroforestry's stochastic friction, which typically keeps the virus from lining up enough transmission. I love that term, stochastic friction. Stochastic means random. Let's explain what Dr. Wallace meant to describe the impoverishment, the bleaching out, the diminution of stochastic friction in the context of conventional agriculture. And to do that, I know that everything we ever learned, we learned in kindergarten. So here's a hopscotch game. And in this stochastic game, it's filled with every type of challenge in every form and dimension. Now, unfortunately, my animation is not working, but I want you to imagine a COVID viral particle at the start, and it gets through, it can do the hop, but it can't even get to the double jump and the spin and struggling, and boy, by the time it gets to the whistle, it can't keep continuing to infect, and it can't get the velocity to escape the ecosystem. That's what Dr. Keesing was speaking about. But now here was my farm. Remember, we started planting in monocultures and in rows. We've taken out all of the stochastic friction. And when you do that, the COVID virus at the start, it has no hoops to jump through. It has no complexity. It can build up all of the momentum necessary, the velocity necessary to escape whence it started to infect we as humans. So before we go to the really good news, some of you may be wondering, but isn't all that biodiversity bad for us? Are we supposed to be happy about all those wild animals and bugs and organisms and pathogens in the forest deep? Didn't scary fairy tales teach us to be afraid? It turns out that the forest is actually our best friend. And again, looking at the work of Dr. Felicia Keesing, there is now substantial evidence that high diversity protects humans against the transmission of many existing diseases, which leads me to my conjecture. Might increased plant and animal diversity achieved via regenerative agriculture create enough stochastic friction to reduce the likelihood of pandemics? What We brought back earthworms and nematodes and voles and bees and butterflies and birds and more. Well, let's go back to that hopscotch game. This is that very complex, stochastically rich hopscotch game, and look at the birds and rabbits and earthworms and squirrels, and you can just see that with all of this complexity, the virus, which is really good at infecting one organism, and maybe if it's lucky, it can infect a second organism, and maybe every just so often, it can achieve the velocity needed to escape where it came from in the forest and hit we who live on the peripheries of the forest. But when you've got all of this biological diversity reestablished in the field, then it becomes literally impossible for the viral particle to deal with all of that stochastic friction. But now, once again, people are wondering, is there a relationship between farming with plant diversity and overall ecosystem biodiversity? Here's an experiment at the University of Minnesota, the Big Bio experiment, and I'm going to go very quickly through this. But looking at 168 plots since 1994, there is a demonstrated relationship between plant diversity, fungal diversity, and insect population diversity, from herbivore all the way to predator. With the use of regenerative agriculture and with the increase of biological diversity, you have an increase in all predators, both insect and mammalian. And if the insects are back, maybe the birds will return. Hoping you can see this. Here's research from upstate New York showing that holistically resourced managed pastures had 1.5 to 4.5 times higher average abundance of obligate grassland birds than minimally rotated or continuously grazed pastures, respectively. Richard Teague, in his research down in Texas with Texas A&M, found that with the use of adaptive multi-paddock grazing, not only did you have overall species abundance, but the pollinators came back. Dr. Alan Williams in the Delta region of Mississippi, he bought land that was so degraded that a hunting lodge abandoned it, and after managing it regeneratively, the animals came back, and now even the hunting lodge wants that land back. And in Africa, you heard Dr. LaSalle speak of Alan Savory in a Savory managed, holistically managed production area in Africa, in Kenya. Not only did the goats get fat, but the wildlife returned to the ecosystem. So we in the Carbon Underground ask, what if every rancher operated, what if every farmer operated his production area, her production area, as if it was a giant insect hotel? What if we optimized biodiversity on every farm and ranch around the world and restored stochastic friction? It's a big what if, and we don't know, but it better work, and we have no choice but to try. The world is running for us. Thank you, Cindy.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tom. You definitely pulled that one off. I appreciate the connectivity, and it's true. It's biodiversity, and the only way we're going to get there is if we actually start farming differently. We need to be farming regeneratively. So with that, thank you very much, Tom. We're going to move to our third speaker, Larry Coppold. Larry has been with the communication and branding professional for over 25 years, working at some of the world's top advertising agencies. He has overseen the advertising for brands such as McDonald's to American Express to Honda, and he's helped launch multi-billion-dollar brands like Acura, Oracle, and Huggies. I like Huggies. Larry has also had a lifelong environmentalist. He's been a lifelong environmentalist, rather, serving on boards like Oceana, the National Marine Sanctuaries, 1%, for the planet, and many others. He has done the environmental communications for the UN and the Olympics, and his work for the Earth Communication Office was seen by over 100 countries, by over 1 billion people. That's right, 1 billion people. Larry has been nominated for both Emmy and Grammy Awards, and we're hoping that he can hit a home run here, batting in third to kind of wrap up this conversation around regenerative agriculture and our current pandemic crisis. So with that, Larry, I'm going to turn it over to you. Can you go ahead and share screen, please?
I can, but first I want to say thank you all for inviting me to speak at the 25th anniversary of Soil Not Oil. It's not the 25th, but for those of us who have been working as long as many of us had, it has seemed like this has been going on for a long time. And that's what I really want to talk about today is the movement, how we're really truly going to change a $7.7 trillion industry, and that doesn't even bring in the $3.5 trillion that comes from fiber. So I am not a scientist, I am not a farmer, as you heard, and I'm going to talk about the numbers. I'm going to talk about business and government and communications and how we can leverage those relationships and tools and convince them to keep our movement not just growing, but accelerating at the rate that you've been hearing. We have to do that. So let me share my screen. Yes, we say we want a revolution. The Beatles were right. But in this case, we're looking for a pandemic regenerative one. Now, I'm going to go back in time a little bit to 2014. It doesn't seem all that long ago. You know, the world was happier. People weren't in quarantine. Kids were in school. We were in restaurants watching sports instead of Russia and the US speed date on TV. And we were all pretty happy compared to now, as we were destroying our soil, pushing farmers to the brink, and perhaps killing the best hope that we had to stop climate change. But then the soil around the world began to speak up. And it literally said, if you restore my health, I will show you some magic. I can feed you forever. I can feed you better. I can even regenerate myself. And a true movement was born. But before it could really take off, it needed a name. So many of us on this Zoom call, many of us at Soil Not Oil, many of us in this movement sat down and talked about it. And we said, well, let's call it what it is. Let's call it regenerative agriculture. That'll be easy, right? Wrong. We got lots of pushback. People said, no one will learn that word, regenerative. It's too big. It's 5 syllables. And there wasn't even an agreed upon definition. A lot of people had been talking about it, but they'd been talking about it in different ways, and we can't ask the world and we can't ask the big food companies to change to it if there is not a clear and acceptable definition. So we created one, and we brought in a lot of stakeholders, many of whom are on this right now, and we created a definition. And these are all the people that either helped us create it or signed on to it. Lots of people. In fact, if you look straight down the middle, you'll see Soil Not Oil was there at the beginning. But a name and a definition don't create social change. There are 3 things that are critical to create social change. You have to have hope. You have to have momentum. And you have to have an expectation of success. So I'm here to report today in our checkup, our 7-year checkup, that the movement is doing pretty well on all 3. In fact, going back to the naming problem that everybody said we would have, recently, one of the top food companies in the world went out and did some research to find out, does anybody know this regenerative thing? Does anybody know what it does? Have they heard about it? And guess what they found? 67%. Now, this is a US-based study. It's important to say that. 67% of people had heard of regenerative when asked. But here's what's more important. It had a much wider range of benefits that were attributed to it than attributed to organic, and that was a real big surprise. In fact, the researcher who had been working on food research for 25 years said, in 25 years of food research, I've never seen a term or a broad desire happen so quickly. Here are some quotes from that research, actual quotes. The soil is the most important thing on earth. Nature regenerates, so we need to do that with our soil if we want to survive. And regenerative agriculture does that. Somebody else said, I want to buy food that's regenerating the land that it's grown on and not destroying it with chemicals. Somebody else said, organic food is great for my health, but we won't be able to grow it soon if we don't regenerate our farmland, which is kind of dead. And finally, one of my favorite quotes, much nicer to heal the land than corrupt it like the farms of Amarillo. I think we would all agree with that. So the name is getting traction, but what about the impact on the marketplace? What's happening there? Well, as most of us know, Whole Foods named regenerative agriculture the #1 food trend for 2020. That was amazing. And that hopefulness is growing very quickly. Big Food is hopeful. Canada is hopeful. The feed system, the feed market is hopeful that it can improve things. The Green New Deal leverages that hope and brings new hope to it. So there's a lot of hope. But if you also want some momentum, this is a pretty good achievement. Regenerative projects can now be found in 140 countries on earth, probably in more. Now, why am I talking about all of this? Well, because we need a revolution. We need to change the single biggest industry the planet has ever seen. So we're talking about changing our entire societal relationship with food, and actually with nature, but more importantly, with the status quo, and that's hard. And I'm here to report today that we have officially arrived. We are officially seen as a threat to the status quo of industrial, chemically dependent farming. How do I know that? Well, because we, all of us, are being officially discredited. The disinformation campaign against regenerative has begun. Congratulations. And I mean that sincerely. Now, I want to go back in time to show you how these disinformation campaigns work. You're going to remember some of these. Let's start with tobacco. So about 50 years ago, scientists were beginning to say smoking is dangerous to your health. In fact, it could kill you. Oh, yeah? Oh, really? Said Big Tobacco. Doctors smoke cigarettes. I mean, look, more doctors smoke Camels, not just any doctors. Doctors in white coats smoke Camels. Well, dentists, of course, smoked Viceroys, and if anybody wants to tell this guy he shouldn't smoke, they're taking their life in their hands. And here was their strategy. Hide the fact that they were doing this, publish research that supports their point of view, suppress any research that does not support their point of view, criticize anything that does get out, change the scientific standards so people will look at the data in a way that helps them, and then get this message to the press, get this message to policymakers. And within just a couple of years, they had placed over 7,000 articles, and they held off legislation on smoking for 35 years. I mentioned organic food a second ago. No chemicals. It's genetically, nothing genetically modified is in there. It's got higher nutrient density. What could possibly be wrong with organic food? Well, there's some people who want you to think there's a lot that's wrong with organic food. There's all kinds of myths that organic farmers and food sellers are pitching you. And you know what? We're gonna bust through those myths. Organic farms don't use pesticides? Yeah, they do. Healthier for you? Nah, they're really not. And they kept pushing more and more information, even getting somebody as esteemed as Joseph Rosen, a professor of food toxicology at Rutgers, who said any consumers who buy organic food because they believe it contains more healthful nutrients than conventional food are wasting their money. Why would I waste my money? Climate change, which is something many of us have worked on, I certainly have. Here's what's interesting about climate change. The people who have been running the disinformation campaign against climate change are the exact same professionals that did it for big tobacco. The same companies, the same strategists, the same PR experts. And you can see what they've done. They're getting you to think about the fact that climate change isn't real. And by the way, look at this. This is the Friends of Science telling you that. You know, global warming is baloney, but don't let that stop you from getting your hamburger at 11 o'clock at night. And by the way, you don't even have to get out of your car. Here you see that there's been no significant warming in the 21st century. I think a lot of scientists might take issue with that. And you know what? Even if you think there is global warming, well, we're not doing it. And oh, by the way, if we are, it's not harmful. And you know how I can prove that? Because that kid is doing super. In fact, he even has a red cape to prove it. So now, fellow regenerators, it's our turn. And now, after years of great reporting on everything that we're achieving and everything that we can achieve, the pushback has begun. And as you can see, they take a story in the upper left, and then they start getting that message. You look at the lower right, and you start seeing this in many places. Then you see more and more and more stories out there. So congratulations. We've gotten their attention, and we've hit the big time. Even something as esteemed as MIT has added to the discrediting of regenerative agriculture. You know, right, we can't count on these carbon-sucking farms, can we? Well, here's what's interesting. They wrote that 2 months ago. You know what they wrote 3 years ago? When they were for it, before they were against it? They wrote, carbon farming is a promising climate response. Furthermore, it can result in significant agricultural and ecological co-benefits like improved soil structure, a robust soil microbiome, better water retention, sequestration of carbon, etc. So what do? Do we ignore it? Actually, maybe we do. Maybe we treat them the same way we treat climate change deniers now, like they are pool tables on the Titanic. They are nothing but dead weight, and we got to keep the ship from going down, or we need to survive. Plus, and this is really critical, who cares about these regenerative deniers? If the buyers out there say they want regeneratively grown food, and to quote Arby's, we have the meat, but we also have the dairy, we have the grains, we have the dessert, we have all kinds of products, but you know what else we have? And this is really important. We have the money. We can show them the success. Talking about the growth of our movement, in this year alone, in the US alone, there will be $57 billion invested in regenerative. Now, $57 billion might not sound like a whole lot out of a $7 trillion industry, but it's bigger than the entire organic industry. And we've achieved this in a couple of years. Tim and Tom talked about climate change and the coronavirus, and to tie it into them, here's a study by Conservation International that said preventing fewer pandemics, basically by keeping our land healthy, would cost 1/30 of the money that the global economy is going to lose in 2020 alone due to this virus. So I'm here to say very happily that this train has left the station, and there are 3 really good reasons why it's never going back. Number 1, we have a better model, and it's better basically for everybody. And as Buckminster Fuller said, don't fight the old model, come up with a better one, and people will move to it because it will become obsolete. So we have that. Number two, the amount of passengers on this train is staggering. Here's a sample of groups and organizations that have got involved in regenerative agriculture. And I'm going to go sort of quickly. We've got countries and local authorities, international organizations and funders. We've got researchers and training bodies around the world. You can see these are all on the train. There's a lot of people to convince that they've made a mistake here. And the third reason, some things are simply irreversible. This movement is irreversible.
Great.
So what's next? We have to accelerate the train. We have to scale the geography that it's covering, and we have to remember never to be shy or defensive as we get these attacks. When someone says we don't have all the answers, tell them they are absolutely correct. Regenerative ag is admittedly more complicated. In this teaspoon of healthy soil, there's 100,000 species. Over here, 1. So yeah, it's more complicated. You want to learn what to do? You can read the label over here. Or you can design it literally from the ground up so that it all works together in a regenerative. But I want to remind you and all of us of one thing, and it's really, really, really important. Nature is literally dying to teach us. So, thank you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Cindy now.
Great. Excellent wrap on that. And we are out of time, so we will not be taking questions, but I just want to hold everybody. You can send us any comments or questions, and we will be providing these slides hopefully very soon on our website. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists. This was really an outstanding group of speakers. And I really appreciate all the time that you've taken to present today. And to Miguel and to the rest of the crew at Soil Not Oil, thank you very much for giving us the time.
Thank you so much, Cindy. It has been amazing. We hope to collaborate in the future and have more presentations and webinars that we are going to be organizing monthly. And we're going to connect. And thank you so much also for participating yesterday.
Very happy. Thank you so much, Miguel. This was outstanding.
Thank you so much.